And the discoveries of the 20th century, the theological discoveries in what they call the liturgical movement that fed into Vatican II, were huge. So people like Yves Congar wrote about the nature of the church, and he said the church is the mystical body of Christ. That's us, right? So the idea that some people had, they say before, was the priest was doing everything, the people prayed the rosary until the priest was done, then they got their spiritual vitamin pill in the Eucharist. And there's something true about that, because the priest has ontologically powers that lay people don't have. But what they rediscovered was that the act of worship, the Eucharist, was an act of the head and the members together offering themselves to God the Father. And so the participation in the Paschal Mystery wasn't just watching some guy do a ritual, but the ritual was the medium through which we could say, I join myself to Christ, Father, and I give you myself to be crucified, to be destroyed, to be risen, to be glorified. And then when I get myself back glorified and it's completed in the Eucharist, that's an action of your heart, your mind, your will, and that's the participation, right? Christ is at the right hand of the Father, giving himself to the Father all the time as a sacrifice. And so Pius XII said active participation was offering yourself as a victim on the paten with the priest. And if you have that in your mind, you're like, oh, this isn't just that boring obligation or else it's a mortal sin. It's, I get to enter into the destruction of Christ's body on the cross. I get to rest with him in the tomb. We just did this at Easter. Then I get to rise with him, and it's all going to happen in 45 minutes. And every time I do it, it's going to become more and more real in me. So I'll be nicer to my spouse and more patient with my kids and do my work better and no road rage and all that stuff. That's the message. And what do we say? Go to church or else it's a mortal sin. Well, yeah, it is, right? But that's not the message. And so the people who grew up in the legalist mentality, who are missing this essential theology, will say, well, the church is the rules and we're all afraid of hell, and telling people they're going to hell all the time and scare them into obedience. Well, that's not what a parent does, right? A parent has to sometimes discipline the child, but mostly it says, I want to give you all the things that I know are good for you. Will you please come and accept them? And so when we talk about architecture, what we're really recovering is, what has the heritage of history and the revelation of God given us that's sweet, delightful, and true, and we get to participate in it so we can die with Christ and rise with Christ? And they were super excited. Like 1955, they were like, we finally figured it out after the French Revolution, what active participation is. And then they wrote Sacrosanctum Concilium, and it said all the same stuff, and they thought the world was going to flower again by being transformed with divine life. Nuclear bombs were going to be dismantled everywhere. The Depression would never happen again. Racism would be over. And what did they get? Base churches, right? And falling away from the faith. Why did that happen? It's a complicated story, I guess. Nobody really knows. But so I think what we have to do ourselves is not retreat to a false antiquarianism or a mere antiquarianism, but say, what's the truth? How do we go forward? And how do we learn deeply from the tradition? So that's a good introduction to this next part right here. So, we're in a classical building here. You see these Corinthian columns all around us. These are big, beefy, meaty Corinthian columns. And they have to be, right? Not just because literally they hold up the ceiling, but they should look as strong as they are because they're holding up the floor above. And see, they're already doing that revelation at the level of structure, right? Heavy things are above us. I'm going to have two big columns, not just one, but two. Literally, they do that work, but they also convey to us the reality of what they're doing. Why they're Corinthian is another story. We'll talk about that. But see, that column has an origin probably, 400 BC, something like that. And then it was used by the Greeks, and it was used by the Romans, and it came from the Egyptians through the Minoans. And so this thing has the DNA that goes back several thousand years. And here it is in, the church hall of St. John CANTIUS Church in Chicago. Why the heck would we do that, right? Egyptians, Greeks, worship of bulls and goats, the Romans, Zeus, Athena. Aren't we just bringing a pagan idol into this church by using that kind of architecture? That's the challenge for using architecture. There's two kinds of critics of classical architecture. One is it's not of our time, and one is it's pagan. And so I think there's a reason we can solve that problem. And if you're really interested in the meaning of classical architecture and you're ready for a serious read, this little book by George Hersey called The Lost Meaning of Classical Architecture is pretty good. It's only like 100 pages. It costs like $10 on Amazon. But it was written in the 80s when people were rediscovering classical architecture again. And he asked this question, why do we use the classical orders? In other words, these columns. Every town of decent size in the Western world has Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, which were the architecture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Even some of the modern buildings, the Pantheon in Paris, which is 18th century, the Capitol in Washington, even the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, when they had contact with the West, started using classical architecture. Why is Greco-Roman classicism not only the architecture of the Greeks and the Romans, but pretty much every other Western society until modernity hit? Even fascism, he says. And you could even, he didn't say it, but you could even say even Judaism of the time of Christ was a classical architecture place, as we saw. Why use pagan architecture for Christianity? Well, here's the bigger context of it. This is the Roman Empire in AD 14, so more or less the time of Christ. So here's Rome. They had gotten all the way up to Britain, and they built Hadrian's Wall. And then North Africa, and then here's Jerusalem. So it's part of the Roman Empire. And remember, Herod is the client king of the Roman Empire. So he's Jewish, kind of. He had a Jewish parent and a Roman parent. So the Jews never knew if they could trust him, but the Romans could trust him. And sometimes I think Herod was a bit like Saddam Hussein, if you remember when he was in Iraq. There were all these warring factions, and he had to hold the factions together with his brutality. And every other head of the role that Herod had only had the job for 3 years max, because they couldn't hold the people together. Herod had it for like 30 years, partly because he was so brutal, and partly because he knew the Roman culture and he knew the Jewish culture as well. So, this is a big Roman area. And so Christ is walking around in the Roman Empire. You don't hear that very often. When you watch the Easter specials, it's always, they're wearing sandals and wearing rags and walking around in dusty little wooden huts. But there was serious architecture. As we saw this temple before, this was the Roman area of Jerusalem in the time of Christ. You see this little half amphitheater there, and the Roman palaces. Herod's palace was back here. It was very sophisticated Roman architecture. And then this is the Antonia Fortress, where the Roman soldiers would stay. And when Paul brought a non-Jew into one of the courts, they all came out because the Jews got all mad, and they were trying to keep the Jews in line. The Jews didn't like having a Roman overlord, and the Romans didn't like that the Jews didn't like having a Roman overlord. So they're always battling who's going to run this town. But basically, it's very serious architecture. This is an outdoor model of Jerusalem in the time of Christ. It's the size of this room. It's at the Israeli State Museum. So nobody really knows what it looks like. This is kind of a reconstruction, but you can see the Corinthian columns here. This is a little triumphal arch, very Roman. This is called the Beautiful Gate. It's where the lame man was healed in the Acts of the Apostles, and Peter talked to him, and then Peter gave this big speech, and the healed lame man ran over, and they talked about the progress of the Christian message. And then these columns around here are big Corinthian columns. What is this, probably 15, 12 feet high? They were 3 times the size of these columns, and there were 256 of them, and they went all the way around the temple. And so there you see those columns running around, and the sort of classical seriousness of Jerusalem. They weren't just walking around in huts. They had serious architecture. And this building at the edge was called the Royal Stoa. And it was a big basilican hall. So when you hear about Christ talking to the teachers in the temple, and Mary and Joseph are looking for him, and they find him talking to the teachers, it's not just a classroom. It's they would hang around here and talk, and they would discuss scripture, and a lot of business would be conducted up there. And this is somebody's archaeological reconstruction of that building when you cut it in half. See the people down here. Does it look like anything to you? What does it look like to you? A big basilican church, right? So the older model of church, the apostles didn't have any architecture. They were just in their living room until Constantine came and put the imperial court ritual on it. Maybe that's true, but it's probable. I would say, if you're a betting person, it's a pretty good bet to say Jesus walked around in this building. The apostles walked around this building. The same part of Acts where it says they broke bread in their homes says they went to the temple every day. And so maybe they couldn't break bread in the temple because they weren't allowed, but they knew this architecture. And in the Antiquities of the Jews, one of these 4th century documents, it said it took, to get around these columns, that it took 3 men with their arms outstretched to circle the columns. So this is a big, big thing. And there are a few bits of it left. Doing archaeology in the Temple Mount is very difficult because the Muslims and the Jews can never agree. Anytime you start digging anything, then the Muslims think the Israelis are, planting listening devices or something. So they won't let them do any archaeology. But they found this leaf from one of the Corinthian capitals that was up there in 2010, and it was a big deal to prove that this building actually existed. So imagine one of these leaves here, and this is some of that. So it would have been one of those capitals right there. And one of the columns that they were bringing from the quarry, which was outside of Jerusalem, actually fell off the cart on the way there, and it broke. You can see the crack in it. And then they just left it there because it wasn't good for them, and the ground level eventually covered it up. In the 19th century, they uncovered it and found it. So if you walk, north of the old city in Jerusalem, you can see just, regular people live around there. There's a little playground and shops and whatever. And then there's a sign that says, one of the columns from the Temple of Solomon is built by Herod. And it's just there, and so you can, trash gets there. They're so used to old stuff over there, they don't really care. But, if this was America, it would be like a building over it, an admission fee and everything. But it's just lying there, big thing. The only way to sort of get a sense of it is maybe this. This is the porch of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. In fact, the description from the Antiquities of the Jews talks about there being a double coil molding at the bottom, which is, these all have names from the Roman Empire, the Upper Taurus, the Scotia, the other Scotia, Lower Taurus. Big, significant buildings. They'd be really impressive, very impressive to go visit. And then we saw this one the last time, that the synagogue of Capernaum would have been bigger than it is. They don't have all the parts of the columns, so they reconstructed them. But it was bright white marble, Corinthian capitals, right out of the Roman customs. And there are some of those details of that leafy Corinthian again. And so, the old St. Peter's was built in the 4th century by Constantine. It was replaced by the current one. There are not a lot of pictures of it, but this is one painting of what the original St. Peter's looked like. And what do you see but classical columns here, these little spiral columns coming down here, and then some mosaic back there. They're not far from the time when the Roman Empire is persecuting Christians and killing them and feeding them to the lions. You would think that you would never, ever take their architecture and say, okay, now this is ours. And the question is why? Why could a Christian do that? And they thought, like early Christians thought, we have an inheritance. We don't have any other way. They didn't have glass and steel. They couldn't just say, let's build glass and steel. But they saw that columns had meaning. They had already developed in the Roman Empire these buildings that were recognizable as temples. They had developed big interiors where lots of people could meet. This is the Pantheon here. You see people walking around in the colonnades, just like the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, built about the same time. And what else did the Romans give them? They gave them rhetoric. You can read all these old Roman books where they talk about how to move people to listen to you. The politicians would use it. How do you persuade somebody? Painting, there was ornamental and figural painting. There were building types used for Christian worship. A tolos was a building used to mark a spot of veneration. So if somebody died in a certain place, they'd build a round building over it. The templum was a place of sacrificial worship. There was already mosaic and sculpture at this time, very developed. There's also architecture. But you think about goldsmithing, they're just ready to make chalices in 5 minutes, right? Roads that were for the military to go out there became the roads that the evangelizers went out on. How did they organize their military, organize their government? It's all there. So in Pompeii, you see some of these paintings that are left, these famous frescoes. This is called the Villa of the Mysteries. They think it's a Dionysian rite of initiation, but they already had a developed system of what are the participants in a ritual, religious ritual look like, and how do you do it? And so there it is. And the catacombs, which we hear about, this is one of the famous ones. There's this mosaic or fresco tradition. This is Hercules killing a snake. And you think, why on earth would a Christian put Hercules killing a snake in there? Well, they didn't have St. George yet, right? They didn't have St. Patrick yet. What are we going to do to symbolize Christ, who fulfills Hercules, who's killing the snake that seduced Adam and Eve in the garden? Well, we're going to use the customs that we know. And so they just brought it right in. And the peacocks there were not only looked like birds that had been brought to their gem-like perfection, right? Take a sparrow, turn it into a peacock. You're like, wow, that's the eschatological perfection of sparrow, with gem-like colors and leaves as the heavenly bird. But they also were working with the myth that the flesh of the peacock never decayed. When they would die, it wouldn't decay, it wouldn't rot. So that was like the human body after the resurrection, or Christ's resurrection. So bring these things right in, and you can use peacocks today, and no one will think you're worshiping Zeus, right? It just comes right into the living tradition. And there was also these traditions of painting portraits of your ancestors. They didn't have embalming, so that if they didn't bury you right away, they would put these little masks over the tomb or the coffin, and then they would remember you. So already, how do we remember our family members? Like this. How do we remember the saints who are our family members? Eventually, it grows into an iconic tradition that's still with us today. So it's not so much Romans bad, Christians good. It's Romans got us pretty far, you know. If midnight is when the world ends, the Romans got us to like 11:45, right? And then Christ is bringing us to midnight for the eschaton. All we have to do is take their stuff, fulfill it, and make it what it wants to be. Jewelers and so on. You get the idea. Interior architecture with a lot of space to gather. And there were also Romans who were pretty smart about what we call natural theology. I'm sure you've seen this famous image of the Vitruvian man. It's named for Vitruvius, who was the only author on architecture from the ancient world whose book still exists. And so he's measuring, talking about temples in particular and how you come up with their proportions. And he says that they are bodies like the human body. And that if you measure your body from your head to your toes and your fingers to this way, you're as wide as you are tall, basically. So you form a square. So when I do this in class, I actually get out the measuring tape and we measure a few students to see if they fit the Vitruvian man. They never do, but they're close, right? And so none of us is perfect, but if you measure enough people, eventually you would see, you know, as x goes to infinity and the number of people that roughly your height and your width are the same. I always tell people too, try this at parties. If your party's not going well, just get the measuring tape out. It's like playing Twister, but it's a higher thing. And you know, if you take the diameter of your belly button and go out like this, it makes a circle. Remember, Christ is the square of the Father, and the circle is the image of God who has no beginning and no end. So the incarnation has a geometric analogy, which is God the Father, who's eternal, and God the Son, who's the square of the Father. And you can say, wow, circles and squares, the Romans figured it out. And they didn't even know God the Father or God the Son, but they were so close that we can come and take it in perfection. And you see things like this, how the circles and squares can be used to design the facade of a building, even the door. And there's lots of ways to use philosophy and geometry and number, measure, and weight are things given by God to the order of creation. So the difference between a lot of modern architecture and classical architecture, excuse me, is that a classical architect will say, what's been done before? What's the wisdom I can learn from 2,000 years? What does nature tell us? What does mathematics tell us? What does geometry tell us? How can we use all that to show the perfection of the next world in this world? What a stereotypical modernist architect says is, how can I impose my will on the material, right? That's the Nietzschean will to power. I am the determiner of what is good. I can make the craziest looking Pritzker pavilion that nobody's ever made before because I have the engineering power to do it. Well, does the embodiment of chaos speak well to the world that we all know is bound to chaos? Is that just an example of its age, or should we try to change the age by bringing order to it? And so these are all the philosophical questions from a modern worldview versus a classical worldview. And another thing that classical architecture does is that all the parts in the whole have a correspondence. So this thing here is a blow-up of this little section here, and then this is a section of the capital. And you can actually draw these lines back and forth, that all the proportions here are multiples of the whole. Just Vitruvius also said if you measure the bones in your finger, or your hand, that it has relationships to other parts of your body. So I don't know if any of you have ever had this done to you, but someone says to you, do you know that your hand is the same size as your face? And you're like, oh, really? And then they hit you in the face. Well, they don't know, but they're playing on Vitruvius right there, because that's what he says, that when the hairline to your chin is supposed to be exactly the size of your fingertip to your palm, if you have your 20-year-old hairline, or that your face is divided into 3 parts. Everybody who takes the art class, the first thing they tell you is draw an egg and divide it into 3 parts, right? And the nose is the 3rd part, and the lips are half of that. And so these proportions of the human body, because they're in the image of God, give you an authority for how things should be. And then all the parts in a building like this are designed in relation to the whole. You can even design the facade of a building. This is Santa Maria Novella in Florence. The whole thing fits in a square, and then the square is cut in half, and then there are circles as proportioning devices. Then it's cut in half this way, and it's cut in half this way, and then you have a 1:2 ratio, which in music is an octave interval. So if you know your organ pipes, a pipe that's twice as big as another pipe will be the octave lower, right? Then if it's twice as small, then it's the octave higher. And so music has proportional relationships that are harmonic or discordant, and so architecture has that, and it's all found in the body, and the body is the revealer of the mind of God. So, one of the things that modern architecture really, really hates about classical architecture is the enrichment of all these moldings and stuff, which they say are not from our age. And then also the addition of ornament. I remember when I first learned this in graduate school, I was kind of shocked. There's a famous essay by a German architect in the early 20th century named Adolf Loos, and it's called Ornament and Crime. Has anybody ever read this? We had a party. It's called the Beaux-Arts Ball at the architecture school, and the theme was ornament and crime. So you either came like a gangster dressed up or came like an ornament, you know, and so that was the theme of the party that night. But this guy was trying to say that ornament was a sign of moral decadence. And so now everybody gets a tattoo, but you know, back 20 years ago, if someone had a tattoo, you'd be like, do I want my daughter dating a guy with that tattoo? Like that would already be a sign that something wasn't right. Now everybody gets them, and so it doesn't work anymore. But he said that if you found a criminal, if you went to the prisons, there'd be people more likely to have tattoos than not. And it was a sign of decadence, and that once they got a tattoo, if they weren't already a criminal, they were a latent criminal. They were going to become a criminal soon. And so ornament was bad. And so the freedom from ornament was the way that you developed culturally. And so if you think of, you know, like the stereotypical modernist architect rides a little black bicycle and has black glasses and a black suit with a little black bow tie, right? This is not the opposite of Liberace, right? Liberace somehow, Las Vegas is decadent and Puritanism is somehow morally uplifting. So these are the two fighting words for modern architecture, but they're also the two essential things in classical architecture that makes classical architecture classical architecture. And so I got these from a scholar named Bill Westphal, who wrote a really great book called Architectural Principles in the Age of Historicism. But essentially, he says that classical architecture is the enrichment of structure. So this is a beam, this is a pole, and the poles hold up the beam. So you can see it happening right here, right? This column is a pole, then there's a beam that comes right across here, and then it lands on the other side, takes it down to the ground. Probably this moldings up here don't have to be here, but they're telling you visually, kind of virtually, that what's above you is being held up by something. You see this very rigorous grid of things. Columns hold up beams, beams span distances, and everything lands on something. Nothing floats. You could have just had the steel in there and not see it, but when you enrich the architecture to show it, we call that decoration, and it usually is enriched where the forces change direction. So the column comes up here, and it meets this, and where it meets that, you see an enrichment. It's the change of direction from vertical to horizontal and vertical again. But this is not to look like a power lifter. This is not the bulging neck Olympic guy with 500 pounds over his head. This is the ballet dancer version of this, right? So it's elegant, it's effortless, it's made to look like there's no gravity. It's the fallenness of the world's heaviness being brought to a lightness and elegance. So I'm old enough to remember reruns anyway of Gilligan's Island. I don't know if you are. When I teach these millennials now, they're like, Gilligan's what? I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so old. They said, well, you remember Lost? And like, yeah, okay. And then they went and they built these bamboo huts. But in the 19th century, there was a guy named Gottfried Semper who was an architectural theorist, and he traveled to the Caribbean, and he realized that the logic of structure of architecture was basically you have a big, heavy foundation that supports everything. You have verticals and you have horizontals, and then you have beams that span distances, often in diagonals. And that was the logical structure of classical architecture. So they would make the bottom tough and rusticated and strong. And you'll see that in this church on the outside. The stones at the bottom are bigger and they look stronger and they look like they can support everything above. And then as it rises, they get more fine and more slender. But see, the walls are not structural, they're infill. So they keep the weather out, just like this silly car here. This door is not holding up the structure of the car, it's attached to it. And so structure and infill are this kind of principal thing in classical architecture. So they would theorize that as people got more developed, they used logs, but it's basically the same thing. These little slats are not structure, they just keep the weather out. And same thing here, it's sort of grass walls and structure. Then as you get better at it, you can do it more perfectly and in a more finished way. And then when you really get to it, you're using all this logic of structure, but with this very glorified way, the inheritance of the column types that come from the ancient world, even the railings, this kind of spiral stuff, is telling you the transition from vertical to horizontal. See how it trains your eye to go right around there in a gradual way. But it's still vertical, horizontal, and beams that span. And this is the Mundelein Seminary, one of the buildings. In fact, I live right there. Those are my windows. So I look out at that beautiful ionic column every day. But verticals, horizontals, and then when it goes backward to enclose that space under there, it has to land on something. So you see they get a flat column back there, and there's the beam. It's just like this, column, beam, column, and it comes right down. Even some of the molding around the windows there, I drew little white lines in so you could see it better. It actually comes up and then it extends outward and then goes like that. And that's to imitate the notion that the lintel would extend past the beam, and so then they glorify it and enrich it. You might see here too, there's little spiral things that come up. They're called volutes. They're almost like bookends. And so when you have heavy stuff on top, there's something called lateral thrust, which is when there's weight coming down, it doesn't just fall through like this, but it pushes outward like this. So if you had a house and you didn't have strong enough walls, it would push the top of the walls out. And so you need those bookends on either side to hold them in. And so that's what that is suggesting. But then it's also cool to look at, right? It's delightful, spirals, mathematics, harmony, shadows, and it makes the building interesting. So there's a structural logic that's not literal, but it's the ornament or the decoration comes out of that. So, there's these little things here called modillions that are the symbolic representation of the ends of the beams that would come out like this. So you probably look around here, there'll be modillions upstairs. This is the chapel at Mundelein. A couple of these fell off in our tough Chicago weather over the years, but they're not only a symbolic representation of the ends of beams, but they're also given a rhythm and a harmony and a meter and a mathematics so that, if you're a musician, these could be considered quarter notes, dum, 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 rest, dum, 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 right? So the smaller those are, the faster your meter is. They could become eighth notes, they could become 16th notes, 64 notes, da 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 da. Or down here, you might think of this as a big string bass or a deep organ pipe going, right? And then da 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 da, rest, da 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 da. And so the mathematics of music get kind of frozen, they say, into the mathematics of architecture, but it's not divorced from the logic of structure. You always see things as they would be if it were made of the things they look like they're made of. Now, one of my favorite stories, and you may have heard me talk about this if you were at the thing in the fall, is the triglyph. And the triglyph is this little motif right here. This molding here is called a tania. These little things here are called guttae, and then the three lines are the triglyphs. And I learned this from that little book by George Hersey. He looked into the word triglyph and said, well, what is that? Where does it come from? Tri means three. In the Greek, a glyph means a line. So if you think of hieroglyphs, that's the sacred lines of hieroglyphics. It's okay, 3 lines, that makes sense. But then in Latin, they were called femores. And if you don't know, can you do a little guess of what femores means? Leg. Femur, right? That's the Latin word for femur. He's like, why are those called femurs? And he started looking around, and this is all speculation, hypothesis, that in the ancient Greek ritual, they would take the bull up to the temple and they would sacrifice it and they would cut the head off, and the skull was considered very sacred because the brain was in there, so the life of the animal. Remember, the life of the animal is being offered to the god. It's not so much the physicality of the animal. And then the thigh bone was so big, it was full of marrow, and for some reason they knew that marrow was life. And so they would cut the marrow, the bone, into 3 parts. They would tie it together with one of the animal's tendons, and then they would stick it up on the building, and the marrow would drip out. And that was the record that the sacrifice of the life of the animal had been given. So it was kind of a bloody mess, right? Like literally bloody stuff. Well, see in architecture, see the bull skulls there, they're called bucrania. Next time you go to the Art Institute of Chicago, you'll see bucrania carved right on the outside of that. Why? Because that's what the classical architecture always did. And nobody asked why until George Hersey said, oh, that's the record of ritual sacrifice. And these are the record of ritual sacrifice. This molding, called tania, is still the Greek word for tendon. And just like the thing that holds things together, and these little drops here, called guttae, are theoretically the marrow dripping out of there. And then, because they had to put it somewhere, they put them on the ugly ends of the beams they didn't want to look at anyway. And so structure and signification start winding up in the same place. So if you ever hire a classical architect, if they don't put their triglyphs on the ends of the beams, then they don't know what they're doing, right? So this is like knowing how to spell. You either know how to spell or you don't. And you don't hire someone to write a new theme for the 3rd millennium if they don't know grammar. You don't hire someone to build a church if they don't know this grammar of classical architecture. So here's the question. Why on earth would the Christians use the record of the brains and marrow of bulls and goats in 5 minutes just because Constantine becomes emperor? Aren't they just bringing pagan religion right into their Christian worship? I actually read a book recently by a pretty well-known scholar who said this was terrible because we're bringing the ritual sacrifice of the pagans into the church. Yes, sir, what's your guess?
They certainly aren't. They're acting upon a common human experience of the human community, baptizing it, and making it speak the whole new language.
Right. So when they first did it, it was bloody. Then they got tired of that, so they put it in a permanent way in an unbloody manner. So what's a triglyph but a record, an unbloody record of the sacrifice of a victim offered to the God on behalf of the people? What does that sound like? The Eucharist, right? The unbloody representation of the same one bloody sacrifice. Wow. I mean, could someone have just sat in a room and thought of this? No. Did it happen from the Greeks and the Romans over many centuries? And then just at the moment that the Christian revelation is given, it's ready to go. That's providence, right? That's not neo-paganism. I see that as providential. And, there's lots of other moldings in classical architecture, too. These little ones here called dentils. Look like teeth, but it's D-E-N-T-I-L-S. It's little tiny structural meanings of the ends of smaller beams. You can also see in good classical architecture, the seams are all in the right place. You can see this little mortar joint here, because you wouldn't put the mortar joint here, because those pieces would fall through. So you'd have a part that extends and lands in the middle of the column. That gives you the strongest logic. And so even if there's steel in there, you want your mortar joints to be where they would have to be if it were actually doing what it has to be doing. And then you can see the joints above that are in different places, but it's centered on the column so that the heaviest part of the stone acts almost like a pinnacle, and it holds everything in the right place. And, when I do this, people say, well, what about the non-Western world, or what if you can't afford lots of stuff? Reasonable questions. This is a pretty new building on the left by Alan Greenberg. Classical building, I would say, even though it's not very elaborate. It has these verticals that meet the horizontal of the floor, then they meet the horizontal of this beam, and they transition from vertical to horizontal with these little brackets, and they're lifted off the ground on these pieces of stone so that they're above the water line of the rain, and the wood doesn't rot, but it also looks nice. It's also wider at the bottom than the top, so it appears to be transitioning from the ground vertically. That's a classical building. It's not an elaborate one, but it's a very carefully designed one. And then some gate in the Chinese tradition, basically doing the same thing, right? Transition from the ground to the vertical and then the horizontals, and then the kind of enrichment at the top. So vertical meets horizontal, and where they meet, there's an enrichment. So it's just a basic process of the glorification of structure. Now, I, being a total architecture dork, a nerd, when I was a kid, if you called somebody a nerd, it was an insult, and the millennials are like, yeah, I'm a nerd. That's like a good word. It means you're really into something, so I've reappropriated the word for myself. There's a book that came out recently. It was the reprint of a 1926 book by C. Howard Walker called The Theory of Moldings. The whole book is a theory of moldings. And one of his diagrams talks about different kinds of moldings. And so the proon moldings are the ones at the bottom. So there's like your feet. And then there's different kinds of moldings that bind. So imagine that's your belt. And then supporting moldings, and then crowning moldings. So if you were going to put a crown molding up at the ceiling, that would actually be a supporting molding. If you had a piece of furniture where it just ended, it would be a releasing molding or a crowning molding. And so people have to put the right moldings in the right place. And if you have an architect who's not trained in classical architecture, oftentimes they'll put the moldings around, but they won't put them in quite the right way. You're like, oh, they tried, but they just don't understand how this works. So this notion of a binding molding is like wrapping a rope around something. So here, for instance, is a binding molding right around here that's going right around the column. Then this would be more of a, what did I call it there? Supporting molding, and then a crowning molding right here. And so there's no magic formula for it, but they should do what they do. And you can see they all have names: Cavetto, Cyma Recta, Cyma Reversa. There's a whole lovely, complicated vocabulary that goes with this. And so when you see it at the bottom of a column, here's two binding moldings wrapping right around, and then it transitions from vertical gradually to horizontal. Even at the top, it transitions from vertical to horizontal that way in a gradual way. And it also happens to fit in a grid of 10 squares. You might not see that right away, but if a square is the image of the sun and then it's divided into 9 parts, each one of these leaves is placed as it fits into the square. So instead of just a chaotic houseplant that you've been neglecting that's near death and wilted, right, this is the kind of version of the heavenly, perfected, geometrically perfect plant that's at the top of the column and still doing that job of decoration. And whenever you cut a hole in a building for a window, you're basically taking out the support that's above it. So you have to find a way to get all this heavy stuff around the window. So there's something called a jack arch, where it's a flat arch, but it's wider at the top than at the bottom so that it doesn't fall through. Sometimes it's done this way. They're wedge-shaped or pie-shaped, so all that weight is carried around. What a lot of people do, if they don't know the difference or they build a cheap building, is they put a plate of steel under there, and then they just put a bunch of non-shaped bricks right there. They call this a guillotine lintel. As you put your head out that window, it's going to fall right down and cut your head off. And because they didn't even think of it very carefully, see, they had to cut this brick into this weird shape. So this is just someone who hasn't thought it through. The average person might say, oh, it's brick and it looks classical. Well, when your eyes really fine-tune, you say, no, that's brick and is classical because it follows this rule of structure that we're calling decoration. And it can be very simple, right? Here's the verticals, the horizontals, some binding, literally binding ropes that are holding it all together. And then it can get very more elaborated. This is a church of, or the seminary of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Denton, Nebraska, where the Fraternity of St. Peter has their seminary. They didn't have a lot of money, but they wanted something convincingly traditional. Every one of these things you can order out of a brick catalog. But the architect was so good, used different colors, different shapes to make the column and the suggestion of the beam and the suggestion of the modillions, and have a classically, credibly classical building with precast stuff. And it's not so much how many medieval, craftsmen can we enslave to make this stuff, which is often the Marxist argument that, we don't have the ability to do this anymore. Architect who's smart, who knows what classical is, can do it in a classical way. Even as simple as this, right? Vertical transitions to horizontal in a lovely way that's very, very simple and very, very economical. Or like this, doing the same thing, vertical to horizontal. Is this as good as the full expression? No. But is it smart? Yeah. Or something like this, a little church in the cornfields of Indiana, somewhere outside of Owensboro, I think. And brick, column, little tiny piece of decoration, vertical to horizontal, then it lands on another one, and the arch goes on the other side. How much extra do you have to pay to get 3-inch depth of brick here so that you can see the shadow and there the beam? I don't know, 0.0001% of your budget. How much more architecture you get? 10 times more. And it convincingly becomes part of the classical tradition. When they added this porch later, they didn't really know how to do it. And it's not quite as good, although they thought they were matching it pretty well. Or if you've been up to Marytown, up next to Mundelein Seminary, same exact thing, but in a richer way. Beams, verticals, horizontals, and they go back and meet a column in the back. Or your very own church here, right? There's lots of this going on. Look at this bottom part here with all, this is called rusticated stone. See how thick the stones look? That's that base of that hut, holding everything up above it. And then there's a big horizontal here. These little teeny columns are kind of strange, aren't they? Because you have all this heavy stone landing on these little columns that are like the size of your 4-year-old kids. But they've clustered them together in groups of 5 or 6 or whatever, so they're appearing to be as strong as they would need to be to hold up all that stuff. If they were as fat as they needed to be, they'd be like up here. So in order to solve the problem, there's just a cluster of them, so they're visually supporting that. And then the columns are up here, or the pilasters holding up that beam. See this keystone here supports the middle of that distance between there, and then it's carried on this molding that has its own capital and its little column that comes down there, and that's held up there. Even up here, the same thing, there's the beam and the 4 supports of that beam, and then the keystone there lands on that arch lands on a column, that column comes down there, that all comes down to the ground. All the enrichment here is structurally logical and is also interesting to look at. And you can get really, high-level stuff in Paris, but basically, that's the grid. That's the plan of it. Verticals and horizontals. And then when you get under there, wow, lots of stuff in there. So this is very formal and rich language. This is bridal clothes, and then other buildings are everyday clothes. But when you look close in there, there's a lot of stuff up there, and that's where I want to talk about ornament. Most people think ornament and decoration are kind of the same thing, and it's all like polite living, Martha Stewart, Pier 1 Imports kind of stuff, Pottery Barn stuff. But ornament clarifies the use or purpose and indicates festivity. That's what the classical worldview had, and that's really a good biblical image as well. So I'll do the quiz here. Do you know where this is based on that little bronze plaque attached to the building? Can you guess? Is it yeah, say it loud, I heard it. Rockefeller Center, and particularly Radio City Music Hall, home of the Rockettes, right? So here they are doing their Rockette thing. And you might not, if that weren't there, you'd see some gray stone. Suddenly, what has happened here? Legibility just popped out at you. Now I know what this is because this thing has been added. This is not ornament equals crime. This is ornament equals increased legibility about the nature of the thing. If you saw a guy in his sweatsuit, great. You see a guy in his policeman's uniform, oh, you must be a policeman, right? You see that stuff that's on him, all that ornament reveals who he is or what he does. Anybody recognize this? It's not too far from here. Well, can you guess what it is, even if you don't recognize it? It's a good guess for the Shedd Aquarium, but it's actually the reptile house at the Lincoln Park Zoo. Right? So, imagine this were a shield or something normally in a classical building. They've made it a turtle, and then the fish are coming down like that. Really smart, right? So this is as old as the classical tradition and as new as the day they built it. Never been done before. There's never been a turtle cartouche or shield before. How about this? If your Latin is good, and you can unjumble all those letters, you might know where this is. It's the Mons Beatitudinum. It's the Mount of Beatitudes, right? And so this is the church that goes into the thing. What you're looking at is something about this high. So this big iron gate. At the bottom is this little mountain, right? Little mountain. And then the letters are all messed up to fit in the mountain. But by actually making the letters less legible, where it is becomes more legible. It's shaped into the Mount of Beatitudes. So it's right near the Sea of Galilee. This is Marytown, not too far from where I live. Can you guess what they do there? Eucharistic adoration, right? You might know that because you've been there, but you would know it if you hadn't been there, because Christ, the Lord, came into the garden of the world, gave himself in the Eucharist, which is still with us. There it is, a plaster molding that tells you what the building is about, but also tells you what the great mission, the continuing mission of Christ is about. And then there are those dentals, which, see, this one is a little bit imperfect here, the little extra space. I never noticed that till just now. That's a crooked tooth, right? It needs the orthodontist. But it's still the logical structure there. How about this? You probably know this is a gate to a communion rail. Why have grapes and peacocks and vines and all that on there? Because a gate, all you need is to keep people out, let people in, right? It could be anything. Why make it out of golden, shiny bronze and have those birds there? And why does a cross appear to be a plant? The tree of life, right? This is the cross, which undoes the fall from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, the angel has the flaming sword and puts it at the gate so they don't have access to the tree of life because they're not ready for it. All of salvation history has to happen first. Now we are, right? So the fact that that cross does that means the tree of life is now accessible to you. On the other side of this is all the action of the new Garden of Eden, which is heaven and earth. Who knew, right? Who knew all that was there? And the peacocks we talked about already, the birds of salvation, of everlasting life. So is it just old-fashioned stuff? No. It's what the old people knew was good and is still good in our own time, and that's necessary through ornament. Anybody guess who this church is dedicated to? No. This is your clue. St. Andrew, right, who was crucified on an X-shaped cross. And so 2 little sticks of wood in the shape of an X tell you immediately who this is dedicated to. Notice the angels are bringing it down on a shield. It's not a turtle this time, but it's an actual shield, bringing it down from heaven. In other words, this iconography is not just a remembrance of the earthly thing, but that has a heavenly reality, and they're bringing it either up to God or down from God. And then see these little drops here? There's a goutte of the triglyphs, which are not there, because the words are going across it, but it's telling you that the triglyphs would be there had they could have been there if they weren't putting text over it. So it's a remembrance of something, and that's what you call an architectural contraction. So it's a do not becoming don't, but it's still the same word. And so when you really get good at this, you can get very playful with it. And notice the seams of these pieces of stone are right over the goutte because that's where the beam would be. And then the beam would be supporting that modillion, which is the beam coming out this way. So you want the beam under it, and then you want that to land in the right place. So this is a person who really knows classical architecture, and they do everything right, even though it's what you could call fictive or virtual structure. And, lots of ornaments on buildings. You'll see the egg and dart in this church. You go upstairs, and the big Doric columns that hold up the roof have these big egg and dart moldings around them, which is very unusual. It's called the Theater of Marcellus. Doric comes from a particular Roman building. And eggs are associated with new life, of course. The life is in there, and you open the shell and see it. So in an egg and dart molding, this is the shell, and this is the yolk inside. So you're not only seeing an egg, but you're seeing an egg fictively opened up so you can see the life in there. And eggs are associated with birds, and birds are always a sign of blessing. You know, the dove brings the olive branch to Noah, and one of the Psalms says, may the sparrows lay her young by your altars, and the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, but it grows into this big tree. Do you know what happens after it grows into a big tree? Birds come and nest in it, right? Unless they're vultures, when birds show up in Scripture, it's good news. And so eggs and birds and all that stuff, it was both a Jewish tradition, but also a pagan Roman tradition too. So here's another egg and dart molding. But this is a necklace here this building is wearing. This one's kind of wearing a big earring. This is not too far from here as well. Or you can see these what they're called CANTIUS, or these sort of swags of leaves and berries. And see, they actually carved the little ring here with the hook and then the string that holds it together. So it's been added to the building. It's like the bride puts her veil on. It's not part of her, but it's on her to indicate her day. So see this necklace running around here? There's another one up here, the larger bead and little beads, and then more eggs, and then the medallions. So without these things, you're just a beige sweatsuit. With these things, you're the bride on the day of your wedding. I threw this one in. Can you guess anything about the church from this? It is a basilica. Indeed it is. And in fact, it's the basilica of all basilicas. It's St. John Lateran in Rome, which is the bishop's church, the Bishop of Rome's church. And so the keys and the umbrella are the signs of a basilica. And we have 3 basilicas in Chicago. And if you see, this is called an ombrellino. It's like a yellow and red, looks like a little mini circus tent. And then there'll be a thing with the bell and the keys under it to indicate it's a papal church. And so that's the symbol of the Pope. But a lot of celebration going on around that. And we showed this one before. Which one of these do you think is marthastewart.com? Left or right? Clearly the left, you know, Yankee, Connecticut tastefulness. A little bit afraid of that ornament equals crime on that side. This is probably some guy named Vinny, you know, on Long Island where I come from. These are all my neighbors. Yeah, all kinds of stuff, right? Notice there's all kinds of people looking at this one and nobody's there. So you have kind of over-the-top festive celebration for Christmas. But even here you have the things hanging on things and the wreath, and even the chandelier has got sort of bands of crystal hanging on things. This is how we indicate festivity. You put stuff on your clothes. This was down in the garment district of New York City. I was walking by and I saw all these trims. I was like, oh yeah, perfect thing. I just took a picture right away that you can add to your coat or to your curtains or whatever to indicate festivity. And they come in all kinds of forms. But notice it's geometry and nature, pretty much. Flowers, gems, geometry, and nature. Flowers, gems, geometry, and nature. Flowers, the new Garden of Eden. Gems, the precious stones of the heavenly Jerusalem, and us brought to our perfection. And the garden stuff. And geometry, from Augustine and others, is chaos is a result of the fall. You get out of whack. When everything's right in whack, so to speak, that's because it's been brought back to the number system, the proportionality it's supposed to have. So these octagons are not for nothing. There's this notion of coming back to that perfection. And in the ancient world, you know, this is a cast, a replica in plaster of a Roman temple. Here's the record of ritual sacrifice. This is the helmet that the priest wore. This is the whip that the guy would drive the ox up to the temple with. This is the water that was poured. This was the knife that was used to cut the animal's throat. This was the axe that was used to hack the animal apart. There's the actual skull, and that's the bowl that was used to pour the blood. So here's a record of ritual sacrifice, but done in this unbloody way, in this architectural way. And if you go to Rome, it's something a little bit off the beaten path. It's called the San Pietro Montorio, sometimes it's called the Tempietto, and it's built on the spot that for a long time was thought to be the spot of Peter's martyrdom. And so here are your triglyphs, right? Record of bloody sacrifice in an unbloody manner. And then here is a missal. Here is the bishop's pectoral cross. Here are the cruets for wine and water. And as you work your way around, you see all the implements of the Mass. So it's not bulls and goats and ritual anymore, but it's brought to its Christian perfection as ornament. And ornaments come in lots of ways. This is one of the little chapels along the way of the cross in Jerusalem. They're doing the same thing. You can see the ladder of the cross and the sponge and the spear. This is the cock that crowed 3 times. This is the whip that Christ was flagellated with. This is the spear that pierced his side, and those are little pliers where they pulled the nails out of the cross. That's ornament that tells you about the way of the cross, because you're on the way of the cross, and it lets you know where you are, what you should think about, and inspire you to say, man, what if someone needed to pull nails out of my hand with that plier? Let me ponder that notion. So ornament decoration, then we'll just finish up with the column. When I give these crash course 1-hour talks, we get like 5 seconds on the column. I love to be, meaty with it. People joke with me all the time that I have columnitis, or, I'm talking about columns all the time. Like if you were a author, and why do you like verbs so much? Why do you like nouns so much? That's what language is made of. So why do you like columns so much? Because that's what architecture's made of. There's lots of references to columns in Scripture. As early as Exodus, Moses talks to the Lord, and then he comes down to remember it, and he sets up an altar, and he sets up 12 pillars that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And then the columns in front of the Temple of Solomon had names. They were bronze, but they had the names Jachin and Boaz, who actually gave their columns names. There's other places where I think someone doesn't have a son. Son dies, and so the prophet names a column, the name of his son, so that the son will be remembered. I forget where that is exactly. Psalm 144, this comes up a lot if you celebrate the Liturgy of the Hours. May your daughters be graceful as columns, adorned for a palace. So not only are they columns, but they're ornamented columns for a palace. And so when you go to places like St. Peter's, you can see columns all over the place. These big columns here, and then these swirly bronze columns that are hollow. Oh, hollow bronze columns. Remember hollow bronze columns from the Temple of Solomon? If you're in the line of Solomon building up the body of Christ, you might use those, even if you're the Pope in the 18th or 17th century. So the art history books will say Baroque architecture, a lot of visual dynamism, light and shade. That's Baroque. What they don't say is that the Pope is the new Solomon, so to speak, the vicar of Christ, and is continuing to build up the church. And so he uses those columns that represent what he does. And they're all over the place. Sometimes people like to say Gothic and classical are enemies, and so that you can't have them. But this is Notre Dame in Paris. You see big Corinthian columns running down the nave. And you probably know they go in a hierarchy from Doric with its triglyphs to Ionic to Corinthian to composite. So when you go to Rome, lots of Corinthian columns because it's the most important church in Christendom. But then composite columns, the highest one over the tomb of Peter, over the altar, because that's the highest status spot within the highest status building in the city. This is the other cool stuff about columns is columns are people. I like to think you could wear a button around that says columns are people. And there are different kinds of people. Vitruvius, who we mentioned before, talked about the mythical origin of columns. And he said the Doric had the proportions of a man because the Greeks didn't know how high the column should be in relation to the width. So they found a guy who they thought had good proportions, and they measured him, and he was roughly 6 times as high as he was wide. And so the proportions of the Doric column became 1:6. This one is 1:5. Then a woman was a little bit more slender, and an unmarried woman was even more slender because she had that waif-like quality of, Twiggy or something from 16-year-old versus someone, middle-aged, gets a little bit of middle-age spread. He said it, not me, so don't take it against me. And then the Ionic, he said, had an origin for being these columns that were representing the married women who were taken into slavery by the Athenian state, and they were known for having these little swirly hairdos that became the Ionic column. And then the folds of the dress, which was called the widow's dress, became the grooves in the shaft of the column itself. And so, wow, if you're an early Christian, hey, the Romans gave us columns that represent mothers. We're going to build a church to whom would we use these columns? The Blessed Virgin Mary, right? Of course, she could be a virgin or a mother. But the first church in the history of the world to use Ionic columns down the way there was Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which was the first church in the West that was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And so we showed this before, but if you know that Ionic are women and they have their hairdos, see she's got some jewels, some gems there in her hair, got a necklace around here, wearing a veil and a flower in her hair. So she's not just a column, she's as graceful. She's a daughter, graceful as columns, adorned for a palace. And columns come in all kinds of shapes and proportions. I got permission from that guy on the right to use this picture for the rest of my life. But that's down in Curacao, and they had the proportions that are very beefy, and I asked him to go stand over there, because some people have beefy proportions. This guy roughly has the proportions of this pier here. And there it is right there in Scripture. Cephas, James, and John are called pillars of the church. And imagine you are all pillars of the church in your own way, whether you're in the Knights of Columbus or the choir or the sacristy or whatever it happens to be. If you go to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, they actually painted saints on the columns. Right? If columns are people and pillars of the church are saints, and here they are literally holding up the big beam that runs across there. It got very literalized there, but usually it's just architecturalized. And there's St. Peter's thing. Remember, the Doric was the column for the man. So Peter's a man, he gets a Doric column. This is the clarity of revelation that tells you what's what. The Corinthian has its own story, though, and they had basically the Doric column, and then this guy, who was an architect in the ancient world, so they say, visited a cemetery where a young girl had died. She was 16, and her parents buried her, and they brought her a basket of her favorite stuff and put it over her tomb in the dry season in the Mediterranean. So there's the basket, and there's the block of stone or the slab of stone they put over. And you can imagine in there her favorite foods and teddy bears or whatever they brought people back then. And when the rainy season came, this plant that was dormant underground started to grow. And this architect came along and said, hey, that's really cool. That would look really good on the top of a column. And this is how they say the Corinthian column was born. So you can see these Corinthian columns right here around us. This one shows the basket is still in there. You can't see the basket too well on this one. But when you see a good Corinthian, you'll see the lip of the basket very often behind the leaves, and that's the origin of it. But a young girl, unmarried, who died, but nonetheless went to a place where something that wasn't really dead but was dormant then came back to life when the rainy season came. He starts to see all the associations that the Corinthian would have, even if it's not a Christian thing at the beginning. So there's lots of them. This is the one up in the seminary chapel in Mundelein, wearing a necklace, and then the leaves, and then the cross right there. And back to that question again. Remember from the first time we talked about Church of the Holy Sepulchre? 12 columns in there for 12 apostles. 5 minutes it takes to baptize that tradition. If columns are people, saints are people, they hold up the mission of the church signifies the mystical body. Well, what better to do it than columns that do that? So, which column type is this? Doric, Ionic, Corinthian? Are steel I-beams just the columns of our day? Because that's what they said in this period. Mies van der Rohe would say, well, in the Middle Ages you had to have columns that were columns, but steel I-beams are the columns of our day. What's the problem with that? I mean, it does what it does, and it's kind of cool. Lots of sunshine inside. Hopefully, it's what? Less is a bore? Oh, you've been reading Robert Venturi, haven't you? Okay, well, Mies van der Rohe was famous for saying less is more, and then Robert Venturi was one of the early postmodern architects, said less is a bore. There's also another architect I read who's not famous who said if less is more, then nothing must be the best. And that's kind of what they're doing here. But yeah, it's clever. Mies is good at it, right? He's very artistic and very precise. But you don't know where it fits in the hierarchy. You don't know if it's man, woman, or unmarried woman. It dumbs down the vocabulary to a right, instead of a song, right? The words are missing. It still has rhythm and meter and all of that, and it still has the logic of structure, but it doesn't transition from here to here. They kind of crash together in an abrupt way. So there's lots of kinds of Corinthian. The famous one famous one is from the U.S. Capitol, where they used tobacco leaves because that was the flora of America. This is the U.S. Supreme Court, where they put the American eagle up there in the Corinthian. Can you guess where this is? Corn. Corn and wheat.
Board of Trade?
Well, it could be the Board of Trade, but where did the stuff come from that they were trading in the Board of Trade? Nebraska, right? This is the Nebraska State Capitol with its column that's Corinthian, but with corn and wheat. How about this one? This is kind of Corinthian, but this is a snail, and this is a snake, and a turtle, and a lizard, and these are water lilies. It's back at the Lincoln Park Zoo, reptile house, right? As old as the Corinthian, but as new and as local as that place. You might know this one, since you're from around here. Any guesses? It's the Lyric Opera, right? So there's the star right off the flag of Chicago, and then the harp right in the middle. And it's kind of a Art Deco-y one, so it's getting into the modern era, but as old as the Corinthian. And this is a Pontiac dealer from the 1930s. See the P right there? Again, modernized because cars are modern, but as old as the tradition. So you can trust the company because they're using traditional architecture, but it's a modernized version of it, and this is how these things work. This is from the YMCA in Jerusalem, where they have the fisher of men, or sort of the fish and the net, and then the water of the Sea of Galilee up there. And then that's from Mundelein again. Well, right up in Racine, Wisconsin is a famous Johnson Wax building. It was closed for a long time. They just fixed it up, and you can go visit there, and it's really worth a visit. It has these what they call lily pad kind of things that are, there's like these round circles up at the top, and they meet in circles. And then there's these little leftover places that have light in it so the sun can come in. And then it comes down on this very long little column, but it gets very slender, gets slenderer at the bottom. And when they did it, nobody thought it would hold up, so he had to insist that it would. And they did these test ones, and they put all this weight on top so it wouldn't fall down. And it creates this very cool thing, like you're underwater and the ceiling is above you. But there's a funny thing about things that get narrower as they go down, which is intuitively we think they're getting weaker. A column is kind of based on a tree, right? So a tree goes like this from the ground, and then it goes like that. So the light things are at the top, and the heavy things are at the bottom, and it gives us this sense of, okay, yeah, if you had a tree where the trunk was this big at the bottom and that big at the top, you would wonder if it was going to blow down on your house in the weather. Now, he could solve this problem with modern engineering, and it's kind of a cool effect. It's what they would call in art history a mannerist effect. Mannerism means you play games with things and you try to surprise people. So there's a famous mannerist Renaissance palace called the Palazzo del Te, where it looks like the stones are falling. And it was just this guy's pleasure house, and we'd have the people over, and he would say, oh, look out, the stones are falling, and they'd jump back. And it was a game, right? It was a fun house. And so there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you're doing. What do you say about Frank Lloyd Wright doing that? Well, I don't know. He wasn't trying to make a statement about the highest and best revelation of God in the world. What is he trying to say? I don't know. It's fun, new, inventive, creative. Sure, that's okay, if that's all you're asking of it. If you chose to do that in a church, you might say, okay, well, what's my theological rationale? And if you could do that in a way that was theologically right, brought the temple forward, water in the Old Testament is often a sign of drowning, death and all that. So the very recent reading about Christ walking on the water means he can control chaos. He can calm the storm. He can walk on water, which was Noah's flood. If you were to say, well, I'm going to look like I'm underwater in a church, that would be like going down to Hades almost and being under there. And so you might want to be careful about what theological statement you're making. But I'm not narrow when it comes to architecture. If somebody does something that's theologically rich and articulate and better than anyone's done it before, even if it's never been done before, awesome. So if Frank Lloyd Wright could turn that into a good Catholic church, I'd say go for it. If he's only doing it because it's nifty and never been done before and it comes at the expense of theological revelation, then I'd say keep it in your Johnson wax, but not at St. John Cantius. It's hard to get a lot of bronze, and to have a solid bronze would be really difficult. Actually casting bronze is extremely difficult, and it's solid, it wouldn't release its heat evenly and probably crack. And even the columns that they would build later that were hollow would crack. When they built those columns at St. Peter's, it was a big deal. I mean, we just look at it like, oh yeah, that's why they did it back then. But they didn't know how they were going to do this. I mean, these are huge columns. Where are they going to get the bronze? How are they going to cast it? How would they melt it? How would they cast it and uncast it so that it didn't crack? So they got all the best cannon makers in Italy to come to Rome, because they were the ones who were used to casting bronze, and then they had them do it. And bronze is fairly soft, and it's hollow, it's not very strong, so there's actually iron armaments inside, almost like a bridge. It's almost like a bridge inside, up at the top, and then these things that are inside the column so that it actually holds itself up, and then the columns on the outside. It's an extremely complicated process to make them, extremely complicated process to keep it from kind of melting down with the softness of the metal. And so that's a long answer to the simple question, which is probably for letting that armament in there, and they didn't have enough bronze. Anybody know the story of where they got a lot of that bronze from? From the porch of the Pantheon, right. So the big church in Rome with the dome, it had the beams made of bronze in its porch, which is extremely rare and kind of elaborate thing to do. So they actually took that down because they thought a Roman monument's great, but the church over the tomb of Peter is better. See, they weren't historicists. If you did that today, the historic preservationist people would kill you, right? How dare you take the old stuff and ruin it? It's the example of its time. It's the only one left. So we're about to make the most important church in Christendom. That's a higher good. So we're moderns, when we think that way. So the Barberini popes were the family that built the swirly column. So the joke in Latin was what the barbarians didn't do, that is, the invading barbarians from Germany didn't steal the bronze, the Barberini did do. So what the Barbariani didn't do, the Barberini did do. So that's the old joke about that. But you see, that's a priority of theological hierarchies, right? The thing over the tomb of Peter is more important even than the only surviving ancient example of bronze beams on the Pantheon. there was a funny phrase that a lot of the modernist architecture, they called Gothic architecture medieval modern. And Baroque was late 18th century modern, right? That which was modern in its day was acceptable, and now we can do modernism in our day because that's the modern of our day. Which is, if you have that Hegelian view of history, that civilizations advance when they do all that breeding of their opposite, then that works. But what new is not the same as theologically rich. So just because it's the next thing doesn't mean it's the best thing. There are lots of times when cultures decline and they forget what's good and they start doing all kinds of junk. And then somebody says, hey, why are we doing this? In fact, Vitruvius, he's writing in 35 BC, and he writes this book to the emperor because he says all the architects in Rome stink and they don't know how to do this. And he was the guy who knew, and he wrote it down, which I sympathize with a lot, because you go to every strip mall and every bank and all the parts are wrong, all the moldings are wrong. It's like, oh, if we only had another Vitruvius, maybe we could help there. So the question is it the new, or is it the new, better way to do what a church needs to do, or what a civic building needs to do? And if it's new and it's awesome, and it does that, great. If it's new and it's a denial of the past, and the new is new because it denies the past, then you'd have to start thinking, is that what handing on a tradition from one generation to the next is about? So there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of people in modernists who are not very good, and then there's the Mies van der Rohes who do it very well. But at the end of the day, you have to say, just because somebody does it well, should it be done? And then that's a different question from the new. It's what's the best sacramentalization of that theological reality that people are meant to encounter? Yeah, it's held up for emulation, right? So St. Peter's was built because they looked at what the Romans did, and they said, we can do better. They had the Pantheon, but it was on the ground. And they had big basilicas, but they were on the ground. But nobody had put the Pantheon on top of the basilica. And Michelangelo was like, hey, we've had 1,500 years to figure this out. We have the Christian revelation. We have the Holy Spirit. We can do everything the Romans did as well as they did, and we're going to do it better. As opposed to, well, we can't do that anymore, so let's just do the best thing we can do with the architects we have. Like, that's an admission of defeat, really, isn't it? We should be able to do better than they did in 1920, and maybe that day will come again. But you still look at the things from 1920 and say, wow, we're not even at that baseline. That's the norm that we should be able to reach, and then even go beyond if we can.